My name is Ricky Hall, and I am the Vice Chancellor for Diversity at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And I'm indeed pleased to be here with you all this afternoon. It is my honor to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Joe Miles joined the University of Tennessee Knoxville faculty in 2010 as an assistant professor of counseling psychology. His research program focuses on multiculturalism and social justice with two related branches, Intergroup Dialogue and Other Group in Multicultural Interventions, and Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Issues. He is an editorial board member of the Journal of Counseling Psychology and received the 2014 LGBT Advocate Award from the University of Tennessee Knoxville Chancellor's Commission for LGBT People. Dr. Miles earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in educational psychology from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He earned a master's degree and doctorate in counseling psychology from the University of Maryland College Park. I can personally attest that Dr. Miles works to create brave spaces where students can struggle with issues of difference. He has been supportive of me, the Outreach Center on our campus, and most important, students. So join me in welcoming Dr. Miles.
Hello, thank you, Vice Chancellor Hall, for that really nice introduction. I'm really happy to be here today, and I want to thank the Diversity Advisory Council for inviting me and to have the opportunity to come and speak to you all, and also to hear all the great speakers who have already spoken today and who will speak this afternoon. I was asked to speak about the psychology of diversity, which first I thought, I don't really know exactly what that is as a psychology professor. It could be a lot of things. So I've kind of narrowed it down to things that are kind of in my areas of expertise that I'm going to talk about today. And so I thought to give you a little bit of background about where I'm going to be coming from, as Vice Chancellor Hall said, I am a counseling psychologist at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Our counseling psychology training program is unique among counseling psychology training programs in the country in that we have a training model that is scientist, practitioner, advocate. And so the advocate piece is the piece that is unique to our training program, and it really emphasizes the need to address social justice issues, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today in my presentation. But we believe that we train individual and group therapists, but that not all problems that people who come to see us face are intrapersonal problems, and we need to be able to address the context in which our clients are existing and living and growing, and a lot of those contexts have racism, sexism, heterosexism, and other forms of oppression that we need to be able to address on systemic levels. So that's kind of where I'm coming at this talk from. So to give you an overview, first I'm going to just give a quick overview of diversity and what I think we mean by that, and the campus climate research. So one of the subtitles that has been used in some of the materials for my talk is about the psychological dimensions that we need to consider in creating an inclusive campus climate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what campus climate is and what some of the themes are that we know from the campus climate literature. I'm going to discuss very briefly some minority stressors that are contributing, that contribute to differential experiences of campus climate. Some of the research that I do, as Vice Chancellor Hall mentioned, is around LGB and somewhat T issues, transgender, but primarily LGB issues and internalized heterosexism, which is a specific form of minority stressor. Other people in our department study different forms of minority stressors like microaggressions. So I'm going to talk briefly about those and how they relate to our campus climate. Then I'm going to focus a little bit more on my area of expertise, which is intergroup dialogue, and as a means for addressing intergroup relations on campus and developing a better campus climate. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some data that we have from Intergroup Dialogues that we've been running at the University of Tennessee. I've got some both qualitative and quantitative data that show some of the impacts of dialogues that we've had over the past 5 years. So in terms of diversity in higher education, basically what we mean by that in psychology is social differences among people. I think that some of our speakers this morning, Dr. Kelly especially, gave a really good overview of what diversity might be. I share a lot of her thoughts on that, but social differences and differences among people is basically what we're talking about. Within both psychology and education, there's a large and growing body of literature that shows the importance of diversity in higher education, specifically in terms of learning outcomes, so things like intellectual engagement or motivation or academic skills, including things like critical thinking, can be tied to the amount of diversity at a school or campus. And also democracy outcomes, so things like civic engagement or perspective taking. Those are some other positive outcomes of diversity on campus. The benefits of diversity can be seen both in including material into our curriculum, but also fostering interactions among diverse individuals on a campus. And so what my argument today basically is going to be that we need to find ways to really foster meaningful engagement between individuals on our campus from diverse social identity groups, including students, faculty, and staff of different races, classes, genders, sexual orientations, religions, ability statuses, veteran statuses, in order to make the most of the diversity that we have on our campus. In the campus climate literature, Sylvia Hurtado has some models of campus climate in which she includes what she calls structural diversity, which is kind of the numerical representation of different groups on our campus. But there are other psychological dimensions of campus climate that we can leverage that are complementary to structural diversity, which is necessary but not sufficient in order to really make use of the resource of diversity that we have on our campuses. And so the focus of my talk will be on really fostering campus climate that promotes diversity and social justice through meaningful intergroup interactions. So just quickly, I've already used the word campus climate a few times, and I know that some of our other presenters did as well. But to give a definition of kind of how I'm conceptualizing this, we can think of campus climate as part of the institutional context that includes community members, attitudes, perceptions, behaviors, and expectations around issues of diversity. It's a multidimensional construct, so there's lots of different aspects to it, and it's subject to and shaped by the policies, practices, and behaviors of those within and external to colleges and universities. So that's kind of what we're thinking of. It's a fairly broad definition of campus climate, but I think that the work that I'm going to be talking about fits within that context. So the research on campus climate, in the past few years, there have been many studies that have published different measures of campus climate. So we might even look a little bit more concretely at what some of these things might be. So we can include things like faculty support or university commitments to diversity. So do you have a diversity statement and other resources that you put behind your diversity commitment? Race and gender-based relations. This is from one particular measure by Hutchinson et al. We could say relations among other groups as well. Climate for diverse groups. So we might ask people, what is the climate like for LGBT people on your campus, or what is the climate like for women? Unfair treatment. So asking people about whether or not they feel that their college or university fairly treats people from different social identity groups. Experiencing insensitive remarks in resources or materials. So I think that the talk we just heard about communications touches on this, as well as thinking about the ways in which people are included or excluded or represented or misrepresented in the curricula and other sources that we have. And the last one here is fair treatment. So what we might think about by this as being a little bit different from unfair treatment is we might ask people, how fairly do you think people in housing treat you? Or how fairly do you think people in the library treat you? So we might look at specific populations of people that work at the university and ask, how fairly do you think you're treated by these different populations? One recent study found several themes in terms of campus racial climate. So I'm going to show a couple of slides here that give some themes about racial climate for different groups. So the first one here is racial climate. I've highlighted, or I've bolded a couple things here that I think are particularly relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today. And that includes that when we're talking about campus racial climate, a study in 2007 found that there was a cross-race consensus by both people of color and white people that institutions don't generally foster meaningful interactions around diversity and multiculturalism. So students felt that there was little support from the institution in engaging in meaningful conversations across race, and particularly about difficult issues like privilege and oppression. And if you think about it, we have, particularly for students coming here who may be coming from places within the state or within the country that have had very little diversity that they've been exposed to, and to expect them to come into a place that is more diverse and know how to do that is potentially problematic. So we need to, as institutions, give them some of the resources and skills to be able to have those interactions. Along the same lines, race remains largely untalked about. That's another theme. And when they asked these people in this study to talk about campus racial climate, a lot of them said, "You're the first person to ask me about this." So a lot of institutions don't even talk about what the racial climate is like. In terms of the campus climate for LGBT people, there was a very large-scale study that was published in 2010 that looked at over 5,000 students, faculty, and staff from across the country and asked them about campus racial climate for LGBT individuals. What they found was that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people were more likely than heterosexual people to report harassment or discrimination. That transgender and gender non-conforming individuals were more likely than cisgender women and men to report harassment and discrimination. And then, not surprisingly, LGBTQ and transgender and gender nonconforming individuals reported that the campus climate was more negative than their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. And it's important to note in all of these campus climate literatures, even though I'm breaking them down by race and sexual orientation, that there is intersectionality at play. And so LGBT and trans people of color reported even worse perceptions of campus climate than white and LGBT and trans people. In terms of campus climate for women, a qualitative study in 2010 of over 14,000 people at a single institution found that women reported institutional sexism, things including inequities in pay, feeling like there's unsafe climates in places like fraternities or other places on or near campus, feeling like there is comments made that are unsupportive of women, in particular mothers or parenting as well. They also found, though, that women tended to want to have deeper conversations about diversity and diversity-related programming on university campuses, where the men tended to feel that the focus on diversity was either sufficient or even maybe too much. So we have some evidence for a little bit of gender difference in perceptions of that. They also found that some men express hostility about diversity efforts or a feeling that this particular university had a liberal bias. So these are some of the things to be thinking about as we're trying to address our campus climate. So to pull out some themes from all of these different areas of literature on campus climate, Harper and Hurtado, who were specifically talking about racial campus climate, but I think that these themes that they pull out are relevant to any sort of campus climate that we're referring to. Perceptions of campus climate differ based on whether people are members of the privileged or dominant groups versus whether they're members of the oppressed or marginalized groups. Students of color or people in the marginalized groups report experiences of oppression and oppressive campus climates. And then I think the thing that's the most relevant to what I'm going to talk about today is that there are benefits to campus climates that support cross-race or just cross-group interactions. So this is one of the things that the campus climate literature finds as a theme, that there are some benefits to fostering interactions between groups of people. I said I would mention some of the contributing factors to campus climate, and I'm going to largely focus on intergroup relations, but I think that there are a few things that myself and some of my colleagues study that are important to kind of acknowledge. The first being minority stress. So there's a theory called minority stress theory that states that minority stress is excess stress to which individuals from stigmatized social categories are exposed to as a result of their social, often minority position. So like any other form of stress that an individual might experience, it has the potential to contribute to negative physical and mental health outcomes. There are several processes involved in minority stress, and those include external objective events and conditions, so things like maybe external and explicit forms of racism or sexism or classism. Expectations of such events. So if you have had a history of experiencing oppression and then you have the expectation that's going to happen, that's another form of stress that you carry around with you that someone who doesn't expect to have those experiences does not have. And then internalization of negative societal attitudes. So some of the research that I do with my graduate students is around internalized heterosexism, so the ways in which LGB people take the messages that they've been socialized about sexual orientation and specifically sexual minorities and turn them inward and direct those negative messages at themselves because they've been getting them all their lives. So these are different processes that occur as minority stress is happening to people. As I mentioned, like other forms of stress, it will wear at our body and wear at our emotions and wear at our psychological well-being over time. And then even broader than, or more specific than minority stress in the general sense, we can look at specific forms of oppression. So we could say that oppression can be overt or covert, so things that are obvious and in the open. They can happen at individual levels, so potentially calling someone a slur based on a social identity category. They can happen at the cultural level, so exclusion or misrepresentation in the media. They can happen on an institutional level, so for example, LGBT people not having federal protections from being fired at the federal level in the private sector. But beyond these overt forms of oppression, there's also, within psychology, a lot of people who study now microaggressions. So these are things that are more covert, more subtle, and Daryl Wing Sue, who does a lot of work on microaggressions, calls them the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely on their marginalized group membership. So, for example, we might say that a person who says I'm colorblind to a white person who says I'm colorblind to a person of color is invalidating that person's experience as a person of color. So we could say that is an invalidating form of microaggression. We could also say someone who potentially on our campus we might hear a student who's heterosexual say that something is gay when they really mean it's weird or bad. So that's another sort of invalidating form of microaggression. So these are just things to be keeping in mind, that these are the sorts of processes that are happening on our campus, and we have different forms of oppression at different level, and they're overt and covert, and so we need to develop some awarenesses around these as we start to engage with one another around issues related to diversity and social justice. And there's the examples that I just talked about. So I think that what we really need to do is to develop a critical awareness that these things are happening and that we exist in this structure that allows these forms of oppression to exist. And we need to be able to, by critical I mean, be able to become aware of these things that often happen unconsciously so that we can challenge them and try to change the systems that we're existing in. Specifically, I think that we need to be proactive about this. There was a psychologist named Nancy Betts who talked about a null environment hypothesis. So this isn't a hypothesis that an environment that neither encourages or discourages individuals, it simply ignores them, is a null environment, and that's inherently oppressive. And so if we think about, for example, Nancy Betts gives some examples with her own career development as a woman who becomes a psychologist and a scientist. If a young woman gets messages throughout her life that women are going to be bad at math and science, and then she gets to college, if the university's environment is not doing anything to help foster her sense of self-efficacy and help her to thrive, the null environment hypothesis says that if you're doing nothing, that actually is perpetuating the system of oppression of women from STEM fields. So we need to work to counteract these messages of socialization that we get about how to be different social identities. And one of the ways that I'm going to talk about doing that is through our intergroup dialogue stuff that we do at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. We need to help people to think about where do I fit into these systems of oppression? How might I be perpetuating some of these oppressive systems? Developing this sort of knowledge, I'm arguing, as does Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, can be actually liberating. That if we realize that we're parts of these oppressive systems rather than inherently bad or pathological, this can be a liberating act in depathologizing. So we need interventions that will, as a counseling psychologist, I would say we need to focus on people's strengths. So a lot of the things that I've talked about are negative things that happen, but the majority of students on our campus, faculty, staff, people in our communities thrive. And so we need to focus on helping to build those strengths that they have. So things like there's a concept that has gained some recent attention in psychology called bicultural competence. So the idea that someone who is a member of a non-dominant cultural group who is able to both survive and thrive in the mainstream dominant culture as well as their own kind of heritage culture. And there's new research that shows that can be a protective factor against negative mental health outcomes when people are faced with oppression. There's also a concept called crisis competence that's been talked about with lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, particularly older adults. And this is the idea that over a lifespan of facing oppression, people develop resilience. And so in this example in particular, when you're an older adult and you start facing discrimination based on age, you already have some resources that you've developed and strengths that can help you cope with it. So that's the idea of crisis competence, that a lifetime of managing stigma helps you to develop some resources. We also need to figure out how to build relationships across groups and prepare students with the skills to be able to productively interact with each other, even through conflict. I've mentioned this already also, just developing a critical consciousness about the social systems that we are all a part of. And developing capacities and commitments to work individually and together towards social justice. These ones that are in bold here are most relevant to the intergroup dialogue work that I'm going to do. As a counseling psychologist, as I said, I do want to talk about I did want to mention at least the focusing on some of the strengths and resiliency that individuals have. So specifically, if we're trying to build relationships across groups and prepare students with skills to communicate productively through conflict, and actually I think that this can apply to anyone. Even within our Department of Psychology, we do some of this dialogue work, increasingly so, in order to make sure that we have the skills ourselves to communicate through conflict. There's a famous hypothesis called the contact hypothesis in social psychology that basically says that intergroup contact, if we can bring together people from across different social identity groups, under certain conditions it can help to reduce prejudice. So specifically, Gordon Allport said we have to have equal status within the contact situation, common goals, interdependence to meet those goals, and the support of some law or authority or custom. In the 90s, Pettigrew, who's a social psychologist, added another condition, which is friendship potential. So these are the conditions in which we can create optimal intergroup contact to reduce prejudice. A huge body of literature at this point supports this hypothesis. So there's been a couple of meta-analyses, so studies of studies, in the past couple of years that have shown, with samples of 500 or 700 different studies, that the contact hypothesis does hold true. And interestingly, it generalizes to members of an entire outgroup. So if we were going to have intergroup contact with, if we created a dialogue with people of different races, the effects of that intergroup contact would generalize to not just the exact people in that group, but to the larger outgroup, even outside that group. And sometimes even those effects can generalize to people from other outgroups as well. One of the things that they hypothesize mediates or facilitates that that effect of intergroup contact is the development of affect or emotion. So intergroup contact can help us to develop empathy for other people, and it can also help us to reduce anxiety about interacting with people who are different from us. So one specific way that we can create intergroup contact is through dialogue. And what dialogue is as a form of communication, it's different from kind of conventional discussion or debate in which the object is often to win or to show someone that you are right. In dialogue, rather, the goal is to develop some shared meaning. So this doesn't mean that we have to agree about what we're talking about, but that I understand you from your perspective and you understand me from my perspective, even if we don't agree. So we can develop some new shared meaning of each other. It's important to note, and I am a counseling psychologist who studies group psychotherapy, but this is not psychotherapy. There's an author who does a lot of writing on dialogue who calls it sociotherapy, because the goal is not to bring about individual personality change, although sometimes that does happen, but it's to bring about change on a larger societal level. So in practice, what this looks like is we might engage with people and say, help me to understand that, or tell me more about that, or ask clarifying questions about what people are asking. Inquire how the person arrived at that perspective. Listen more than we're talking. Check for understanding, so saying things like, what I hear is this, and doing a restatement. Asking open-ended questions, asking what or how and not why. And these actually, if you have ever taken or ever taken in your life a basic counseling skills class, a lot of these are actually basic counseling skills. So using open-ended questions rather than closed questions keeps a dialogue moving rather than you say no, I ask you another question, you say no. So we try to ask open-ended questions. We tend to stay away from using why questions because they can sound judgmental. So why did you do that? Versus like, how did you come to that decision or something? I guess I didn't include it on here, but there's a specific method of dialogue called the LARA technique, which is LARA, which stands for listen, affirm, respond, and add information. And this is one that is used a lot at the University of Michigan and their program in intergroup relations, where you listen to what someone has said to you. You affirm, which doesn't mean necessarily agree, but you find a point of connection. So even if you disagree very strongly with someone, that point of connection might be, I can see that we both feel very strongly about this. Then you respond to their question or their comment, and then you might add some information. So here's my response, and this is why I feel that way. Or maybe we need to get a little bit more information to continue to have this dialogue. Oops. The second thing that I think that we need to do that dialogue can help us do is to develop a critical consciousness about social issues. This draws on critical multicultural education, in which the word critical implies a conscientious effort to examine how individual and group life are meaningfully connected to group identity and how those identities exist within structures of stratification that afford members of different groups privileges and disadvantages, resulting in continued group-based inequalities. So critical in this sense doesn't mean we're critical of each other, or it's not intended to be a negative thing, but we're being critical of social systems. Critical multicultural education moves students beyond a mere appreciation of diversity and holds central the analysis of social inequalities and the role members of both privileged and disadvantaged groups can take in creating change. So we want people who engage in dialogue to kind of critically look at the systems that they're a part of, seeing how they're perpetuating them and also how they might stop perpetuating them. And what this involves is becoming aware of overt and covert forms of oppression at multiple levels, as I mentioned in a few slides ago. The last goal here is to develop capacities and commitments to work individually and together towards social justice. So I say here not just diversity, social justice, and I think that some of our speakers today have already talked about social justice, and I know that Dr. Black's university's commitment was really along the lines of a lot of the things I'm going to talk about here with social justice. But it's more than celebrating diversity or multiculturalism. It's really about the equitable distribution of resources and risks, that all individuals are physically and psychologically safe and secure, that all individuals are self-determining and interdependent, feeling both a sense of personal agency and responsibility to one another, that there's full and equal participation of all members of society, regardless of ability status, age, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, race, religion, sexual orientation, social class, or veteran status. And what this necessitates really is that we look at systemic and institutional levels rather than just at the level of the individual. So I have an example here of, as a therapist, if I had a client that came in to see me at the University Counseling Center, this woman here who's a black woman who may present with depression or anxiety or one of the common presenting concerns you might see in a counseling center, it would be important to assess what things are like for her in the classroom. So does she see representations of herself in the curricula? Is she treated fairly and justly and appropriately by teachers and fellow students? What is her life like outside of the classroom? So this is a picture of the strip in Knoxville. I actually am facilitating right now an intergroup dialogue on sexual orientation, and we had this interesting discussion about the other day about where people feel safe on campus, and someone said, I don't feel safe anywhere on the strip. And so I had that in mind when I put this on here, that I think that different members of our community feel more or less safe in different places. And then just kind of generally looking at experiences of racism or oppression or sexism that this person might be experiencing. So if this person came in and was presenting with anxiety or depression, and I just worked with her individually in the room and asked her about herself, I think I'd be missing all of those contextual factors that might be contributing an understandable response of depression or anxiety. So I'm going to get to talking more specifically about intergroup dialogue and what this looks like. So the model of intergroup dialogue that I use at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, I also used at the University of Illinois when I was an intern there, and at the University of Maryland is where I first learned about it. And it originally comes from the University of Michigan and was developed in the mid-'80s in response to racial tensions on that campus. Since then, it's really become kind of the go-to standard for intergroup dialogue in higher education. What this does is that it brings together individuals from social identity groups that have had a history of tension or conflict between them. So for example, we might bring together people of color and white people, or LGBT and heterosexual people, or women and men. So a lot of different combinations. At our university, we also do intergroup dialogues that are around social class. So we bring people from varying social classes together, and religion and spirituality. Some of the design elements of intergroup dialogue that are important are that it creates opportunities for sustained communication across group and across differences. So this is where I mentioned earlier that we can have structural diversity at our university or college and not be making full use of that if we don't have opportunities for sustained and meaningful interactions. And intergroup dialogue is one way to create that. It also adds an affective component to cognitive learning. So earlier I mentioned that one of the mechanisms through which we think intergroup contact is effective is that it helps us to develop empathy for other people. It helps us to reduce anxiety when we're in intergroup contact situations. And intergroup dialogue allows us the opportunity to have that sort of affective component rather than just having someone lecture at you. And then the last design element is that it balances process and content. And so I mentioned here the idea of a group as a social microcosm. Someone mentioned earlier today that we can think of our universities as being a social microcosm in which whatever happens at the university is reflective of the larger society. And this is even on a smaller scale. We might say that what happens in a smaller group of individuals interacting would be also reflective of the social system. So the critical dialogic model that comes from Michigan has 4 different stages, and the first stage is coming together, forming relationships, then dialoguing about commonalities and differences, which includes dialoguing about experiences with privilege and oppression, then dialoguing about hot topics. So this might be, for example, in sexual orientation dialogue, dialoguing about same-sex marriage. Oftentimes, I think in social class dialogues, people want to talk about different forms of welfare or food stamps. They're hot topics that involve intergroup relations that we don't often talk about in intergroup settings and actually get into some of the conflictual stuff that's there. And then the last stage is alliance building and action planning. In psychology, there's a model of group development that is forming, storming, norming, performing. So it kind of goes through different phases of coming together and building relationships and figuring out how you're going to do this. And this mirrors that as well. So we come together and we don't jump right in to say, okay, today we're here to talk about privilege, but we spend a couple of weeks developing relationships and talking about what dialogue is and how we're going to do this to kind of set the groundwork for getting to those more difficult parts of the dialogue later on and those hot topics. The idea here also is that we're not trying to avoid conflict. And you'll remember that I said the idea is also not to come to agreement. So we want to really talk about these sort of conflictual hot topics and privilege and oppression in ways that we don't often do, and really not avoid the conflict that's a part of it, but work through it. So that's kind of the model that we have here. There's 2 shifts that happen over a period of weeks. So at our university, we do these dialogues over 8 weeks. And the shift that happens is from kind of lower risk to higher risk. So as we build relationships and feel more comfortable with each other, then we start talking about privilege and oppression. And then we start talking about these societal level hot topics. The other thing that happens is that there's a shift in focus from the individual to a focus on institutions and systems. So when we start out, we're doing things looking at socialization, and I've got some examples I'm going to share with you what that looks like. And then we get into these hot topic issues, which are more systemic. There's a growing body of research on the intergroup dialogue as well that shows positive outcomes, and so things like affective positivity, so positive affect when you're interacting with others, cognitive involvement, and this is where we get into things like analytical thinking about society and critical thinking, development of intergroup empathy, development of intergroup collaboration and action, reduced stereotypes, perspective taking. So there's a wide variety of positive outcomes that we see from this, and I'm going to share with you some data from the dialogues that we're running that also show some positive outcomes that are a little bit different. So at UTK, since 2012, we've facilitated 24 different intergroup dialogues as part of the multicultural psychology class that I teach. The topics have been religion, social class, race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. If you're curious about exactly how we develop these groups, I can give you more information kind of back channel. But out of these 24 groups, we've had 202 undergraduate students who have participated. And these groups have been facilitated by 34 different graduate students who take an advanced group class with me. The undergraduate multicultural class that I teach, the objectives of it are all around building multicultural competency, which in psychology we view as developing knowledge, skills, and awareness. I view the part of the class that has the textbook and has the tests and has the lectures as really facilitating some of the content knowledge, but also we take some of the values from pedagogy of the oppressed that the students are coming with some valuable knowledge that I don't have as someone with my own particular social identities. So we value the knowledge that they're bringing as well. Skills, so we develop a skill set in how to dialogue with each other. And then attitudes or awareness. So a lot of what we do, especially in the early stages of dialogue, is to help people develop some self-awareness around their own socialization, their own social identities, and what that means. In the graduate course, it's an advanced group methods course, so all of these students have taken an introductory class in group counseling or some sort of group methods class. But this class is focused on also developing their multicultural competence, but specifically as it applies to doing group work in psychology. So our class meets on Tuesday and Thursdays across the entire semester. For the first 8 weeks or so, or maybe 7, we meet all together. The undergraduates all meet together, so about 40 to 60 students, depending on the semester, on Tuesday and Thursday. And then starting halfway through the semester, they meet in one of these intergroup dialogue groups, but we still meet on Tuesday all together. As I mentioned before, the goals of these intergroup dialogues are developing cross-group relationships, skills in intergroup communication, developing critical consciousness, and developing a commitment to social justice. A typical session outline, I'm going to give you just an idea of some specific things that we might do in a session. So this one here is we use an outline, a very general sort of outline that is written by people from the University of Michigan, but then we kind of fill in some of our own activities. But we do an introduction and a check-in. So for example, we might say, share what you've been reflecting on since your last session. Then we would use some kind of common language or organizers. So one of the early sessions I have the students read Bobby Harrow's Cycle of Socialization, which introduces them to the idea of what socialization means. So that's if you haven't seen it, and this is probably very hard to read, it shows, we're kind of born as more, can you read it? No. If you're interested, I can share it with you. But it shows that you're born and you don't have an idea of what social identities mean until you start to get influence from your parents and your religious organization and the media and your peers and your school. And so as you're a part of this, you start to understand how society categorizes you and what it means to be a boy or a girl or whatever sort of social identity. So that would be our conceptual organizer. We'd talk about socialization, and they would have read something like that. And then we do an activity where we have them do a family tree. So we'll sit in class and we'll say, so we want you to draw your family tree. They can be as creative as they want to be. Some of them get very creative and some of them are less creative. But what we want them to do is for each person that they include, and it can be as many people as they want, however they consider their family, we want them to include the messages that they learned from that person, either implicitly or explicitly about gender, for example. So if it's a gender dialogue. So if I've done this in with my family tree and I'm doing a gender dialogue, I might put, I learned from my dad that men drive the car and men do the yard work, and I learned from my mom that women go shopping and do the shopping. And those aren't things that my parents ever told me, but that's what I picked up on from them and observing their behavior as a child. So we go through this family tree sort of activity, and then we do some processing. Then we do a collective reflection and dialogue on the learning activity. So students share what they've thought about, and we look at commonalities and differences of experience. And then we start thinking about, so what does this all mean? These are the messages that we receive from very important people in our lives about how we do gender. So what does this mean? And we try to put it in a larger context. And then finally, we dialogue about the dialogue. So we'll do kind of collective reflection on the learning from the entire session. We might talk about how we're doing as a group, how the dialogue is going. And then we'll do just kind of a check out and looking forward towards the next session. The other activity that I'm going to mention quickly is what our students have come to know as the jelly bean activity. I'm guessing that many people in here have done things like a privilege walk, where you read a list of privileges and you take a step forward if you have that privilege, so you can get kind of a differential view of privilege in the room. Because of a lack of space, some of my creative grad students decided to do this jelly bean activity where they got clear plastic cups and a big bowl of jelly beans, and every student has a cup in front of them and they read the list of privileges. And if the privilege applies to you, you take a jelly bean from the bowl and you put it in your cup. And then you can kind of see some people's cups filling up and others not. And I have been very surprised at how strong the reactions get. And I have students write critical reflections after each session, and I've had people write about things like not wanting to take the jelly bean and hear the sound of it drop in their cup because it makes them feel so, they get such a visceral reaction to it. So that's another example of an activity that we do. And we would do that with our conceptual organizer for this might be reading Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. So to give them an idea of what privilege means and what that looks like, and then we would do this activity. So is this working? We're doing these dialogue groups at UT. I finally have enough data to do pre and post dialogue studies, and one of my graduate students defended his thesis, and this is some of the results that he got, and we've submitted this and we're revising it, hopefully to get it published. But we have found significant positive changes, and I mean positive in the good sense, not a correlation. We have found significant positive changes in empathic perspective taking. So from pre to post, our students show increases in their ability to take the perspective of people from other groups. And we've also found decreases in, or increases in awareness of racial privilege and institutional discrimination. So we give a measure of colorblind racial attitudes, and we see that after participating in these dialogue groups, they have a greater awareness of privilege and of institutional discrimination. The things that we haven't found changes in are things that are more, I think, basic attitudes toward diversity. So we give them a universality diversity scale, which is having this attitude that you can value both similarity and difference. And we've also given them an openness to diversity scale, and we don't find significant changes in that. I interpret this, and obviously I am biased in this, but I interpret this as being positive because I think that some of the more critical outcomes, like this awareness of institutional discrimination and awareness of privilege, that's what we're seeing changes in, and that's what part of our goal is to develop this critical consciousness. And we probably have a selection bias that these students have chosen to take a multicultural psychology class, so maybe they're already open to diversity by the time they come into the class. We also find increases in, we'll give them measures after each session to look at things like the climate of the group, the types of affect they were feeling during the group, their perceptions of how deep the session was or how smooth or rough it was. We find increases in engagement over time, and engagement, the way that we measure this, we use a measure that's actually from group psychotherapy, is really looking at the extent to which they find the group important, they think that what is happening is meaningful, they like and care about each other. So those are the types of questions that we ask, and over time that goes up. We also find decreases in avoidance, so avoiding of interpersonal problems. They say that they're actually avoiding each other less over time. And we don't find changes in conflict. So we look at interpersonal conflict, and that tends to stay pretty steady. And if you'll recall, I said earlier that in dialogue, we're not trying to avoid conflict. I actually think that if we're having a dialogue on something like race that is a contentious issue in the United States and has been and will be for a long time, and there's not any level of conflict, you're probably not really talking about it very deeply. So we don't actually see changes in the level of conflict, but we still see people becoming more engaged and avoiding less over time. In terms of affect, so at the same time, while people are becoming more engaged and avoiding less, we see that there's, on the left there, I've got a graph of negative affect over time. So you can see negative affect actually goes up and positive affect goes down. So even though they're feeling more negative things happening, they're still becoming engaged in it, and they're still really engaging in actual interpersonal and intergroup issues with each other. We also see that over time they think the top ones are the same with the affect, but the bottom have ratings of session depth and session smoothness. So over time they think that they're getting deeper into what they're talking about, and that it's less smooth. So the questions that we ask them are: was the session comfortable? We have them rate on a scale from uncomfortable to comfortable or rough to smooth. Over time, they think it's getting rougher, but they think it's getting deeper, and they're more engaged in it. So I have qualitative data that I actually think is probably maybe a little bit more interesting or easier to grasp for this. But after each session, I asked students, both the group members and the leaders, to write about what was the most important thing that happened in the session and why was it important to you. So at this point, I've had 8 sessions times 202 group members, and so we have a lot of these data now to start looking at. But I think in terms of the goals that we have for the groups, we see evidence of building intergroup communication skills. So one group member said, the members of my group dialogue started off being reserved and gave little personal information. As the session progressed, we became more comfortable around each other and began to share personal opinions. I believe that the leaders of the group dialogue played a huge role in making us feel comfortable and safe to open up. We played an icebreaker and set ground rules that must be enforced during all dialogue sessions. The establishment of ground rules was the most important part of last week's intergroup dialogue. Some of our rules included respecting others' beliefs, think before you react, do not attack another member, and ask questions if you do not understand someone's perspective. The ground rules made everyone feel free to express their beliefs without being judged or ridiculed. The ground rules were important for me because I sometimes feel insecure speaking my perspectives in our large class. I know that there are extremely opinionated individuals in our class, and I do not want to be attacked in front of everyone. I already feel comfortable and relaxed in my dialogue group, and I know I will be able to actively participate in our discussions because of the environment we have already established. I'm going to skip over that one for now. We have some evidence of developing critical consciousness. So things like the most important thing that happened for me was the cultural chest activity. So one of the first things we do is have people bring in items that represent their culture to them and then share them with the group. Each member of my group had to bring in 3 objects that represented their race and or ethnicity. We were instructed to decorate the outside with words or pictures that described how we felt that the other people saw us. Through sharing our cultural chest, we got to learn more about each other's group. It was interesting to see the objects group members had brought and why they were significant to their identity. I really enjoyed this activity because it forced me to think deeply about myself. I feel that I've never actually sat down and thought about what defines me and what aspects of my life display my race and ethnicity, because it seems like my race and ethnicity are innate and I am just myself. After the activity, I look at people and myself differently. We all have family histories and certain things that are unique to our backgrounds. These qualities are what make us diverse, and you can't tell a person's race and ethnicity just by looking at them alone. So I won't continue with that because I'm aware of the time and I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. But when we do post these, I've got a few other examples that I think are pretty great to read some of the things that the students were experiencing in some of these groups. So when we post those, you'll be able to read them more if you're interested. There's also some students that talk about developing a commitment to social justice, and what I like about those is they say, I didn't think about these things at all before, and now everywhere I go, it's all I can see is oppression. I mean, like, that's not a great thing that is what they see, but they're seeing it, so it is. Conclusions and moving forward, I think that the intergroup dialogue has been a meaningful way for us to create some cross-group interactions at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I hope that we can find ways to continue to develop and grow that capacity for us. So, thanks.